Art is powerful, but it is not powerful enough to undo centuries of colonial domination or climate catastrophe. Lola Olufemi. Art is a place to think, even if it's also a place where that thought gets repackaged and commodified. Hannah Black. This is a web of non-linear thoughts, quotes, months of opened, restored computer tabs, post-it noted books about some work that began 4 years ago. It began with paperwork. Imagining is not compatible with funding bids. What would this work look like? How do I translate conjured images into administrative processes? No, it isn't about multiculturalism. Could you delete that, please? No, not ethnic minorities. And please, could we refrain from using the word diverse, please? At the time of writing, I'm travelling to Rochdale to close Gut Feelings Mary Jan with the burial of a seed book from the exhibition. Collectively with the community, we're going to read each page in Urdu or English before tearing the pages up and planting them in the grounds of Deep Bush Community Centre. The book contains texts studied or written by the group. It momentarily offers a new set of classifications. B is for breath, F for freedom, G for grief and growth, T for tongues. And in planting it, returning it to the ground of Deep Bush, it resists archival logic and takes root into something new, futurity. Like with everything in this work, it dodges or dances around its expectations. What should be gazed at or read becomes digested or buried. What kind of transformation can occur when we break tradition? Asher Gamezi says, there's a very colonial concept of tradition as something that is fixed. Tradition as this ahistorical, static, non-moving thing. But I understand tradition as something that emerges through people grappling with their world. That's how tradition develops. The afterlife of this work is potent and fertile. The show has ended, but the conversations within the group have not. I think we've sown some seeds for the future. I think the group knows their terms of engagement. Though I've been trying to process what all this work means, intimate work with an obligation of going public, what it means to be a brown artist doing this work now. I'm troubled by it, I'll be honest. Despite efforts to redistribute power since the beginning, the truth is I still benefit more than the group, and the institutions, art organisations benefit more than me and the group together. I've been transparent with them from the start, making sure they know their currency. After all, in the local studies archives, we could see evidence of arts funding following societal rupture, 9/11, the Bradford riots, in the guise of British arts-funded sticking plasters, often resulting in ethnographic community arts projects disinterested in challenging power dynamics or structure. Dr. Sana Asan writes, in relation to the field of clinical psychology, that the BLM uprisings ignited a season of white panic. She goes on, universities had to react rapidly to secure that money, churning out EDI action plans within weeks to meet the deadline, each outlining how they would reach 9 key performance indicators for addressing racial inequality. There was little time to think, breathe, or have space to respond thoughtfully or systemically. Before we knew it, EDI consultants, many of whom were black and brown people, were transplanted into institutionally racist academic spaces for 1 day a week, for 1 year, with the goal of promoting racial equity within a equality, diversity, and inclusion framework. But could we trust the money would be honoured to dismantle whiteness? And if so, could one person be recruited in to fix an enduring, deep-rooted systemic problem for 1 day a week, for just 1 year? EDI would be better placed as endless distraction and inaction. Within the arts, there's a similar flurry, and whether it's the intention of the institution or not, we are caught up in it. It was amidst the anxiety of the first UK lockdown that we formed a group, convened on Zoom, and I held space for us to study, listen to one another, and raise consciousness. We navigated shared historic legacies of colonialism and migration. We thought about land and our relation to it, about our inheritances, what we hold dear and leave behind. The study of archival material was supported by texts from my bookshelves and files on my computer to help us listen to these images, as Tina Camp teaches us. For what we cannot see requires listening instead. Photos from countless newspaper articles, oral histories written in third person. What are the quiet frequencies of the nameless, the spoken for? It was hard to stomach. Nasreen emails me after week 2. I'm actually intrigued in the way my body is reacting and the emotions it triggers. Jasleen, Mary Jan, these are uncharted territories for us, much to learn, mourn, and come to terms with. Interacting with the archive is disembodying. It promises truth, but all the context is missing. Lola Olufemi writes, "The archive, with all its shadows and gaps, is a colonial invention in narrative consistency." So what is the narrative of this place? What has got stuck here that I want us to unstick? I've been thinking about how archives are these hard, weighty, permanent, dominant narratives. They're public national memory. They're the reference point for the future, even when riddled with flaws. What do we find when we go looking for ourselves in the archives? What stories are told about you? Narratives stick to certain bodies, and the archive reinforces it. How are black and brown bodies coded in Rochdale? And can the performative be an act of refusal, defining oneself rather than being swallowed into others' fantasies? The films in the show document a series of performances, remixed customs, preserved by group members, performed at local sites, bound up in histories of empire and post-war migration from former colonies. We, members of the resulting diasporas, washed a statue of an industrialist, a building, and bodies with yogurt, living culture, the same thick, tart dye served alongside biryani that has properties to heal the gut where trauma is stored. We walked aimlessly in bucolic Lancashire landscape and dared to come into voice in spaces we're told our bodies don't fit. We ate the contents of a public archive, an act of destruction, or inviting our bodies to digest the undigestible, the indigestible, processing it anew. I felt mischievous. I wanted to disrupt images presented of us. I wanted to take art out of the gallery and into the mess of daily life. Reading about one's precarious passage to Britain, encounters with racist immigration policy, substandard housing, racism in the mills, families terrorised by the National Front, made us think about Shamima Begum, pals fighting the EDL, Grenfell, Brexit, inhumane nationality and borders bills, all of which is evidence of how the forces of state legislation shaped our elders' lives and continue to shape ours. Quote, "Although the identity artist is often praised or accused of being very personal, the material of race gender is not personal at all. It's systemic." The writer and poet, Suhaima Manzoor Khan, wrote an article in The Guardian last year on the cricket racism scandal in Yorkshire, wool, that can then be mapped onto Lancashire, cotton. To fully understand this racism, we need to look deeper into the social and economic forces that shaped Yorkshire's Asian population. British colonialism, working class exploitation, and racist border legislation can all shed light on the distinct manifestation of racism that Rafiq, the cricketer, and all of us well know. Yorkshire's textiles mills and iron foundries were first built during rapid industrialisation in the 1800s by merchants whose money came from the slave trade, in which they exchanged goods pillaged from elsewhere for human beings at the West African coast. Profits made from enslaved labour were invested in new technologies such as locomotives, which were then exported to help pillage other colonies, or raw materials that were turned into cloth, which colonised countries were forced to buy. In 1832, Indian weavers petitioned Parliament to complain that British cloth imports, alongside exploitatively high taxation on Indian cloth exports, were undermining their industry, pushing many to leave their jobs, eventually to simply export raw cotton that Britain would spin and sell back to them. The industrialisation of places such as Yorkshire was built on through the deindustrialisation of India. She goes on to say that these conditions led to her granddad being in search of work in rural Punjab in the 1960s, later migrating to Bradford, as many people did, working in the mills that had contributed to the impoverishment of their homeland. In knowing this, the mechanisms of empire, the narrative is made inconsistent. My dad, a poor working class man from Delhi, said to me growing up that the Raj was a good thing. It built infrastructure for India. What would India be without its railways? I can kind of understand how he thought this. He knows of an India which kept him and his family in a place of poverty. He wasn't supported, he escaped. But reading Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, we understand that the railways were built by the East India Company to transport extracted resources, coal, iron ore, cotton, and so on, to ports for the British to ship home to use in their factories. Quote, "The railway workshops in Jamalpur in Bengal and Ajmer in Rajputana were established in 1862 to maintain the trains. But their Indian mechanics became so adept that in 1878 they started designing and building their own locomotives. In 1912, therefore, the British passed an Act of Parliament explicitly making it impossible for Indian workshops to design and manufacture locomotives. Between 1854 and 1947, India imported around 14,400 locomotives from England and another 3,000 from Canada, the US and Germany, but made none in India after 1912. After independence, 35 years later, the old technical knowledge was so completely lost to India that the Indian railways had to go cap in hand to the British to guide them on setting up a locomotive factory in India again. The story of my Dadaji working for British Ford, dying of a heart attack on the factory floor, becomes a different story with this context. British Empire stripped resources, wrote policy to oppress people until they migrated elsewhere in desperation of labour or died. I can't think about belonging migration stories without thinking about empire and how it persists. I've been thinking about this quote from Hannah Black's The Identity Artist and the Identity Critic. To perform as evidence of the institution's purity, the identity artist has to exemplify a race-gender category, but as soon as she steps into the institution's embrace, she becomes an example of universality. She is artificially cleansed of race-gender, even as she is called on to represent it. I've been thinking about how we, the group, resisted the label South Asian, not as some performance of woke politics, but to point out that we are of Punjabi, Bangladeshi and Pakistani heritages, and that these namings carry the weight of different oppressions in colonial India and in the diaspora. There is no universality here. Quote, "We're always trying to escape the conditions of our lives, and there is no doubt artistic practice helps us to do this. But when we imply that the sole purpose of art is helping discover a shared humanity, or a way of feeling that is not dependent on time, location, and all of the other markers that organise our lives, we blunt the knife that might help us tear these markers down. Art is best utilised as a weapon, a writing back, as evidence that we were here. Colonial identities run deep. Divide and rule is alive and kicking. For example, Sikhs, along with the Gurkhas and Pathans, were conveniently identified by the British as a martial race. My ancestors became objects of use in the world wars, and yet somehow, amongst the pomp and conservatism of war centenaries, a majority Sikh community misreads this violent history as military pride and valour. A British Sikh identity becomes a weapon of the state. We're not melancholy migrants, we're happy objects, Sara Ahmed might put it. I cling to stories of Nanak travelling in kinship with his Muslim brother Mardana, composing and singing spirit music together, a pre-colonial kind of radical love I'm running towards. But how is my brown body complicit with state-constructed notions of terror? Images that stick to a specific set of brown bodies. The 2013 Trojan horse scandal, an anonymous hoax letter alleging an organised Islamic plot to introduce Islamist ethoses into schools in Birmingham, propelled our government into Islamophobic hysteria, resulting in Britain's multi-million-pound counter-terrorism strategy, including Prevent, which ranges from British values in our children's nurseries to doctors spying on their patients in our GP surgeries. The state funds so-called anti-terror laws and diversity initiatives. These thoughts are so messy, and I'm still working through it all, but if exhibitions offer a snapshot into a moment, a set of ideas, I want to hold on to this one. Attention to spokespeople from marginalised groups could direct attention away from the need to change the social system that marginalises them. I've spent so much time trying to divert your gaze through the making of this work, trying to not fall into the thirsty identity trap, resisting artist come native informant, complicating happy narratives. I did not let our vulnerabilities enter the gallery. Everything was composed ever so carefully so as to not fall into that trap. Art is my way of processing, but it's also someone else's currency. I'll end by leaning on a final set of words by Zarina Muhammad to crack open this thought further. Between these three sets of films, this show, the group presents a front. This is their output. They did the work of digging and discovery in the Touchstones archive. They unpacked it all, and now this show is like a reflex or a response. Everything that unfolds in the films and within the gentle container of the gallery feels measured and timed. They present us with a tight logic of specific action. Yogurt as a symbol or sign, literally a living culture being wiped over monuments and buildings and then pressed into contact with bodies, hair. The group eat the documents they read aloud in the archive, not as an act of destruction, but a kind of reclamation. They reintroduce this material to the interior world. The body claims it through an act of digestion. Actually, digestion holds a double meaning too, because by reading these things aloud, they give these stories and truths a kind of air. They hold them up to us, viewer and group. We process them together. So digestion becomes a way of rationalising these heavy, heavy things. The only thing is, I think the exhibition is sleight of hand. It's a kind of illusion. It isn't the point. It's really good stagecraft, the costumes, the rituals and the aesthetic choices, from the rolling fields, the plastic covers on the chair, the empty bucket of yogurt, the step machines. It's all the front end of a metaphor. Jasleen and the group have spent all this time just speaking and being together. They've forged connections and shared stories. Throughout that process, they've looked back and figured out where they are. The group spans generations. This connection is a kind of conspiracy because it means they can measure their relationship to history, to archives, to monuments, and all the other bits of large-scale culture that make up this silly country. I don't know what those conversations were. I don't know what was shared, and I don't know anything about the quality of the relationships that make up the group. But what I do know is the exhibition isn't the point, the group is. They have undergone a change. In sharing with each other and processing this material, they now have a renegotiated relationship with history itself, and that is where I think it gets dark. I don't know how to say this without sounding like a pessimist. History is stuck. Or we are stuck when history says we should be moving. Either way, something about the loop we're in feels like running in a dream when your limbs are sticky and slow and the bad guy's close behind you. I don't want to look back because we should be going forwards, but there's nowhere to fucking go. What is forwards? I don't know what is to be gained from renegotiating our relationship with history by looking back into the archives to see where we came from, because looking back at the past and looking at the present, all I can see is that we haven't really gone anywhere. As aesthetic choice and ritual gesture, this show was beautiful, but gut feelings Mary Jan sat heavy with me because I think the best we can do is go limp, collapse into this country's bad vibes and try and dig out some happiness amongst it all. To be honest, maybe that's the content of those hidden conversations. Maybe that's the point.